A cargo droid on level 4 dropped an entire crate of glass jars right onto the deck, and nobody even turned to look. Every eye in the market ring of Harrow Station was fixed on the three shapes walking calmly past the noodle stalls. They were big, bigger than most people expected an animal to be. Their fur was dark gray, almost black, and it moved like water over long muscles with every step. Their eyes were pale gold, and they walked in a loose triangle, noses low, tails swinging slow and easy. To anyone who did not know better, they looked like large, strange dogs out for a walk. To everyone else on the station, they looked like the end of the world. A trader dropped her basket of dried fruit and backed into a wall so hard the shelf behind her rattled. A pair of station guards near the fuel depot went pale and reached for their weapons before their training even caught up with their fear. Somewhere behind the noodle stall, a small alien child was pulled off her feet by her mother and carried away at a dead run. Walking behind the three animals, completely unaware of the panic he was causing, was Dale Foster. Dale was not an important man. He hauled cargo for a living, mostly grain and machine parts, sometimes livestock, and he had docked at Harrow Station 3 times before without anyone giving him a second look. He was tall, a little sunburned even after years in space, and he wore the same worn jacket he had owned for 8 years. Today he was walking his 3 dogs before his ship left on its next run, the same as he did every time he docked somewhere with open air and a clear path to walk. "Come on, Duke, don't sniff that, you don't know where it's been," Dale said, tugging gently at the leash clipped to the biggest of the 3 animals. Duke ignored him and kept sniffing a crate of fermented root vegetables with great interest. Scout, the leanest of the 3, sat down in the middle of the walkway and watched a small floating drone zip past overhead, his head tilting with obvious curiosity. Biscuit, the youngest, gave a low, happy huff and pressed against Dale's leg, looking for attention. None of them noticed that the entire market ring had gone silent around them. Dale finally looked up from untangling Scout's leash and blinked at the empty space that had opened around him. A moment ago, there had been dozens of aliens moving through the market. Now there was a wide, careful circle of empty floor, and beyond it, people staring at him from behind crates and stall counters like he was carrying a bomb. "Okay," Dale said slowly. "Did I walk into some kind of ceremony or something?" Nobody answered him. A low, urgent voice crackled over the station's public address system instead, speaking in 3 languages at once, telling all civilians to clear the market ring immediately and remain calm. Dale's stomach dropped, not from fear, but from the specific kind of dread that comes from knowing, somehow, that this is about you. Station security arrived less than a minute later, 6 armored guards moving in careful formation, weapons raised but not yet fired. Their leader, a broad alien with plated skin and small tusks curling from his jaw, stopped 10 paces away and held up a hand. "Human," the guard said, his voice tight. "Step away from those animals slowly." "They're not animals, they're my dogs," Dale said, more confused than defensive. "Duke, sit. Scout, come here." Both animals obeyed instantly, sitting on either side of him, tails wagging. Biscuit flopped down entirely and rolled onto his back, clearly hoping for a belly rub from anyone brave enough to give him one. The guard's face went, if anything, even more pale. "Do you have any idea what those are?" the guard asked, his weapon still trained on the 3 of them. "They're Ashfall hounds," Dale said, using the name he had made up for them years ago, since nobody in any database he had ever checked had a name for the species. "I've had them since they were pups. They're friendly, I promise, they just look big." The guard exchanged a look with the guard beside him, a look that Dale did not like at all. "Sir," the guard said carefully, "you are going to come with us, and you are going to bring those 3 with you, and you are not going to make any sudden movements while you do it." Dale looked down at Duke, Scout, and Biscuit, all 3 sitting patiently, tongues out, tails thumping against the deck, utterly unbothered by the armed guards surrounding them. "Sure," Dale said slowly, raising his hands even though nobody had asked him to. "Whatever this is about, I'm sure it's a misunderstanding." He was walked through the station under armed guard, his 3 dogs trotting calmly beside him the entire way, and every alien they passed pressed themselves flat against the walls to give them as much room as possible. Whispers followed him down every corridor, words in half a dozen languages, but one word kept repeating no matter what language it was said in, a word that made the guards around him grip their weapons a little tighter every time they heard it. Gravemaw. Dale did not know what the word meant yet. He would not find out until much later that night, sitting in a holding room with 3 very confused dogs pressed against his legs, when a calm, careful alien voice on the other side of a security screen finally explained exactly what his good boys really were, and why half the galaxy had spent 300 years hoping they were extinct. The holding room was cold and mostly empty, just a metal bench and a single flickering light overhead. Duke lay across Dale's feet with a heavy, contented sigh, as if being locked in a room by armed guards was simply another part of the day's walk. Scout paced the small space twice before settling near the door, ears twitching at every sound in the hallway outside. Biscuit climbed halfway into Dale's lap despite being far too big for it, and Dale let him, scratching behind his ears out of habit more than comfort. "Whatever they think you 3 are," Dale muttered, "they're wrong. You're just good boys." On the other side of the security screen, a station official watched the readout from a scanner with hands that would not quite stop shaking, and quietly began drafting a message that would leave Harrow Station within the hour and reach the highest levels of the Galactic Council before morning. Rain on Ashfall did not fall soft. It came down in fat, oily drops that stung any bare skin, hammering against the broken roof of a bunker where 3 pups lay curled together in the dark, starving and shivering, too weak to even whine. Dale had not meant to land there. His cargo ship had taken a hit from a debris storm 3 days out, and by the time he limped it down through the atmosphere, Ashfall was simply the closest rock with enough gravity and air to survive on. He did not know, at the time, that the planet had a name on every star chart in the galaxy marked with a warning, or that most captains would have burned every drop of fuel they had left rather than set down on its surface. The world greeted him with gray skies, dead forests turned to black glass and patches, and a silence so complete it made his ears ring. He spent the first day just getting his ship stable enough to breathe inside, and the second day picking through the wreckage of an old structure half a kilometer from his crash site, hoping to find parts he could use. That was where he found the bunker and the pups inside it. There were 3 of them, all skin and bone, packed together in the corner of a collapsed room that might once have been a laboratory. Broken glass tanks lined one wall, and rusted machinery with tubes and restraints sat scattered across the floor like the remains of something nobody was proud of. Dale did not know what any of it meant. He only knew that 3 animals were dying in front of him, and he had food in his pack. He knelt down slowly, keeping his hands low and open, and set a strip of dried meat on the ground between them. The smallest one lunged for it first, and the other 2 followed a heartbeat later, and Dale spent the next hour just sitting on the cold floor, feeding them piece by piece, while the rain kept hammering the broken roof above. He named them that same night, sitting by a small fire built from broken furniture, because it felt wrong to keep calling them the pups once he had decided they were coming with him. The biggest one, already showing signs of a stubborn streak, became Duke. The quick, sharp-eyed one became Scout. The smallest, who fell asleep against Dale's leg within minutes of eating, became Biscuit. It took him another 4 days to repair his ship enough to fly, and in that time he explored just enough of the ruins to understand, in a vague way, that something bad had happened on Ashfall a long time ago. He found faded warning signs in languages he could not read, rows of broken containment cells, and a mural on one collapsed wall showing a pack of animals like his 3 pups standing over fallen soldiers. He did not think much of it. Old wars left old wreckage everywhere, and he had 3 hungry animals to worry about, and a ship that still smelled like burnt wiring. He never checked a single database for what species they belonged to. Out here, on the edge of trade routes nobody official cared about, nobody asked questions about a hauler's pets, and Dale liked it that way. He called them Ashfall hounds because that was where he had found them, and left it at that. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. Duke grew into a massive animal with a low, rolling growl that made strangers nervous and a habit of leaning his full weight against Dale's legs whenever he wanted attention, which was often. Scout stayed lean and fast, always first to notice a stranger on the cargo bay ramp, always the one pacing the perimeter of wherever they stopped. Biscuit never really grew out of being the baby of the group, even long after he had grown bigger than Dale himself, still rolling onto his back for belly rubs from anyone patient enough to give them. There were signs, if Dale had known to look for them, that his three dogs were not exactly ordinary. A deep gash Duke took from a piece of falling scrap metal closed almost completely within 2 days, with barely a scar left behind. Scout could hear the whine of a ship's engine changing pitch through 3 layers of hull plating, long before any instrument on Dale's own console picked it up. Biscuit, still a pup at the time, chewed through a reinforced storage door meant to survive a hull breach, purely out of boredom, one long haul between systems. Dale noticed these things the way anyone notices their dog doing something a little unusual, filed them away as funny stories to tell other haulers over drinks, and never once thought to wonder if there was a reason behind them. He fed his 3 dogs, walked them at every station that allowed it, and slept better at night with all 3 of them curled somewhere nearby than he ever had before finding them. He did not know that somewhere far above him, in the quiet offices of a Galactic Council building, an old file-marked species believed extinct had just been reopened, and that a careful, patient alien named Counselor Wren had been given the task of finding out exactly how a lone human hauler had ended up in possession of 3 living, breathing grave moths, and what, if anything, needed to be done about it. Back on Harrow Station, sitting on the cold bench of a holding cell with Biscuit's heavy head resting in his lap, Dale had no idea any of this history existed. To him, the 3 animals beside him were simply Duke, Scout, and Biscuit, the same 3 dogs he had carried out of a dying bunker in the rain years ago, and nothing that had happened since had ever given him a reason to think of them as anything else. That was about to change. Counselor Wren hated the sound the debate chamber doors made when they opened, a long metallic groan that always seemed to arrive right when tempers in the room were highest. It groaned now, right as 3 different delegates were shouting over each other about a file that had, until 2 days ago, been sitting untouched in an archive for over a century. Wren slipped into the chamber quietly and took a seat near the back, hoping to observe before anyone noticed him. It did not work. The presiding speaker, an old official with tired eyes and very little patience left for shouting, spotted him immediately and rapped a small metal rod against the podium until the room fell into an uneasy silence. "Counselor Wren," the speaker said, "you have read the report from Harrow Station." "I have," Wren said, rising to his feet. 3 live grave moths, in the possession of a single unaffiliated human, apparently for several years, with no signs of aggressive behavior recorded prior to yesterday's incident. The chamber erupted again immediately. A delegate from one of the older member species stood so fast her chair clattered backward, insisting the animals be destroyed before the sun set on the station. Another delegate, representing a species that had studied captured gravemaw remains for decades, argued just as loudly that they should be seized alive and transported to a secure research facility instead. A third voice, quieter but no less firm, pointed out that no law currently existed for a situation exactly like this one, since the treaty banning the species had been written under the assumption that none of them had survived the war that ended 300 years ago. Wren let the arguing continue for a while, mostly because interrupting it rarely helped, and used the time to read through the same report a second time. The details did not change no matter how many times he read them. A human named Dale Foster had found 3 gravemaw pups on Ashfall, raised them without any apparent knowledge of what they were, and had, according to every witness statement from the market ring incident, 3 animals that responded to basic commands and showed no interest in harming anyone unless directly threatened. It did not match anything in the old records. The old records described war beasts, engineered killers bred by the Vantis Combine to break enemy lines during the last great conflict, animals so dangerous that entire fleets had been reassigned just to help contain them once the war ended and the Combine's breeding program was shut down. It did not describe anything that sat still for belly rubs. "If I may," Wren said, finally standing again once the shouting had thinned out enough to be heard over. "Before this council decides to destroy or seize anything, I would like permission to investigate directly. I want to see these animals, and the human who raised them, for myself." The speaker considered this for a long moment, tapping the metal rod slowly against the podium. "You have 3 days, Counselor," the speaker said finally. "After that, if no clear resolution has been reached, the Council will authorize direct action, and I do not think I need to explain to you how that will likely end for the human and his animals." Ren did not need it explained. He left the chamber within the hour, boarding a fast transport bound for Harrow Station, carrying nothing but the file and a growing, uncomfortable feeling that the old records might not be telling the whole story. He arrived at the station 2 days later and was brought directly to the security wing, where Dale Foster had been held in a modest, if plain, guest quarters rather than a cell, mostly because nobody on the station's security team had wanted to be the one standing guard outside a room containing 3 grave moths for an extended period of time. Ren found Dale sitting on the floor of the small quarters, back against the wall, with Biscuit's head resting heavy across his lap and Duke stretched out along his other side. Scout sat near the door, watching Ren the moment he stepped through it with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Ren's neck rise, though the animal did not growl or move otherwise. "You're not the guy from before," Dale said, looking up. "You look a little less like you're about to shoot me." "I am not here to shoot anyone," Ren said carefully, choosing a spot to stand that gave Scout a clear line of sight to him, on the theory that hiding his intentions from an alert animal was rarely a good idea. "My name is Ren. I have been sent to understand what happened here, and what should happen next." Dale's expression shifted, some of the tension in his shoulders easing slightly at the calm in Ren's voice. "Then maybe you can finally tell me what everyone's so scared of. Nobody's given me a straight answer since they dragged me in here." Ren studied him for a long moment, then studied the 3 animals around him, none of which showed any sign of the behavior described in the old files. He made his decision carefully. "Your dogs," Ren said, "are called grave moths. They are the last known survivors of a species that was used as a weapon in a war that ended long before you were born. Every government in this council has laws requiring their destruction on sight." Dale's arms tightened slightly around Biscuit without him seeming to notice he had done it. "They're not weapons. They're dogs. My dogs." "I believe you may be right about the first part," Ren said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "But I am afraid belief is not going to be enough to stop what happens next, unless we can prove it to people far less willing to see what I am seeing right now." He did not tell Dale, not yet, about the 3 days the speaker had given him, or about the delegates already drafting authorization for direct action if his investigation failed to produce answers quickly enough. He also did not tell him about the second, more urgent message that had reached his transport just before landing, a brief and unconfirmed report that a Vantis Combine vessel, a faction officially disbanded over 2 centuries ago, had been detected on approach to Harrow Station's outer sensor range, moving with purpose and asking no questions at all about docking clearance. Grace Hale was in the middle of counting spare filtration coils when the docking bay lights switched from white to red without any warning klaxon at all, which was somehow worse than if one had gone off. Grace had worked as quartermaster on Harrow Station for 6 years, long enough to know that every alarm had its own particular sound, its own particular meaning, and its own particular level of danger. No sound at all meant someone had cut the alarm system on purpose before doing something they did not want anyone reacting to in time. She dropped the coil she was holding and reached for the comm unit on her belt, just as the far docking clamp on Bay 9 let out a groan of metal being forced rather than released. Through the reinforced window at the end of the storage corridor, she watched an unmarked vessel settle into the bay, far too large and far too heavily armed to be any kind of cargo hauler, and far too quiet in its approach to be anything friendly. "This is Hale," she said into the comm, already moving toward the security office at a run. "Unauthorized vessel has forced docking at Bay 9. I need every available unit there right now." Nobody answered her immediately, and in the silence, she heard the first sound of boots hitting the deck, plating in formation, dozens of them, moving fast and organized in a way that civilian security drills never quite managed. 2 decks up, in the guest quarters where Dale had spent the last 2 days answering Ren's careful questions, Duke's ears snapped upright a full 10 seconds before any alarm reached the room. He rose to his feet in one smooth motion, a low sound building in his chest that was not quite a growl, and Scout was already at the door, nose pressed to the seam where it met the frame. "What is it?" Dale said, sitting up straight, and Ren, who had been reviewing notes on a small data pad, looked up sharply at the sudden tension in the room. "Something is wrong," Ren said, standing quickly. Before he could say anything else, the station's actual alarm finally caught up with events, blaring through every corridor with a message repeating in 3 languages that armed intruders had breached Bay 9 and all civilians should shelter in place immediately. Biscuit whined, pressing himself against Dale's legs, and for the first time since Dale had known him, the sound had nothing playful in it at all. The combined strike team moved through the station with brutal efficiency, splitting into 3 groups the moment they cleared the docking bay. One group secured the corridor leading toward Station Command, cutting off any chance of a coordinated station-wide response. A second group headed straight for the security wing, where their intelligence, gathered from a leak somewhere inside the council itself, told them exactly where the 3 grave maws were being held. The third group stayed behind at the bay, guarding the ship and cutting down anyone who tried to interfere with their exit route. Grace never made it to the security office. She rounded a corner directly into the path of the second group and found herself staring down the barrels of 4 unfamiliar weapons, held by soldiers in plain gray armor with no insignia at all, which told her everything she needed to know about how much they cared about being identified. Where, one of the soldiers said, his translator flattening every emotion out of the word, are the grave maws being held? Grace did not answer immediately, and the soldier did not wait long for one. He struck her across the shoulder with the flat of his weapon hard enough to drop her to the deck, and stepped over her without a second glance, his squad moving past toward the security wing at a jog. Grace pulled herself back up against the wall, ears ringing, and reached for the comm unit that had skittered a few feet away, sending a single warning burst toward every channel she could still access before the strike team turned the corner ahead and vanished from sight. That warning reached Dale's room 4 seconds before the door blew inward. Ren was thrown backward against the far wall by the blast, and Dale barely had time to throw an arm up against the smoke and debris before the first combined soldier stepped through the ruined doorway, weapon already raised and tracking toward him. Duke moved before Dale even finished flinching. There was no growl this time, no warning at all, just a blur of dark gray fur closing the distance in a fraction of a second, and the soldier's weapon fired once into the ceiling as he went down hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs before he even understood what had hit him. Scout was through the doorway a heartbeat later, meeting the second soldier in the corridor with a speed that made the man's return shot go wide, sparking off the wall a full meter from where Dale still crouched against the smoke. "Get down," Ren shouted, pulling himself back up despite the blood running from a cut above his eye, dragging Dale further from the doorway by his jacket as more shots cracked through the corridor outside. Biscuit stayed pressed against Dale's side through all of it, not joining the fight, not yet, but standing over him with every muscle coiled tight, a low sound building in his throat that no longer had anything playful left in it, and his pale gold eyes fixed unblinking on the ruined doorway, waiting. More boots were coming down the corridor. A lot more. Dale looked past Ren at the doorway, at Duke and Scout already moving to meet the next wave of soldiers pouring in from the smoke. And for the first time since finding 3 starving pups in a bunker on Ashfall years ago, he understood, with a cold certainty settling into his chest, that whatever his 3 dogs actually were, he was about to see all of it. The first combined soldier through the cargo hold door never got a shot off. Duke hit him low, driving him back through the doorway and into the 2 men behind him in a tangle of armor and weapons, and by the time any of the 3 had untangled themselves enough to aim, Scout was already among them, moving too fast for their eyes to properly track, low and fast and precise, every strike aimed to disable rather than kill, a fact none of the soldiers were in any position to appreciate in the moment. Ren had never seen anything move like it. He had spent years studying old files on the war, reading dry reports about Gravemaw combat effectiveness written by officers who had survived encounters with them and never fully recovered from the memory. None of those reports had captured what he was watching now, tucked against the wall of the ruined guest quarters with blood still running down the side of his face. The reports described monsters. What he was watching was something closer to a storm, violent and overwhelming, but with a kind of terrible precision behind every motion, as if some part of the animal was still choosing, even now, exactly how much force each moment required. More soldiers poured into the corridor from further back, and this time they came ready, weapons already raised, clearly having received warning over their comms about what had happened to the first wave. Dale, still crouched behind Ren with Biscuit pressed hard against his side, watched three of them raise their weapons at once, aimed not at Duke or Scout, but at the doorway itself, clearly intending to collapse it and trap the animals inside the smaller room. "No," Dale said, and before Ren could stop him, he was moving, shoving past the counselor and into the corridor, directly into the line of fire. It was, without question, the single most reckless thing Ren had ever watched a person do in his life, and it worked only because Biscuit moved at exactly the same moment, placing himself directly in front of Dale with a speed that should not have been possible for an animal his size, taking the first shot meant for Dale's chest across his own shoulder instead. Biscuit did not go down. He staggered, a sound tearing out of him that made Dale's blood run cold, but he stayed upright and stayed between Dale and the soldiers, and the sound that came out of him next was not pain anymore. What happened over the following 30 seconds was later described by 3 separate witnesses in 3 separate reports, and no 2 accounts fully agreed on the details, mostly because none of them had been able to properly follow the speed of it. What was agreed upon, in every account, was that the combined strike team that had entered the security wing with 11 soldiers left it with 4, and that none of the 4 who escaped tried to fire another shot on their way out. Scout took down 2 more soldiers attempting to flank around a support pillar, moving with an economy of motion that left them disarmed and pinned before they understood the fight had already ended for them. Duke tore through the remaining line with Biscuit at his side, the younger animal favoring one shoulder but showing no sign of slowing. The 2 of them working together with a coordination that spoke of years spent as littermates who had never once needed words to understand each other. Ren watched from the wall, and somewhere in the middle of it, understood something the old files had never once bothered to mention. The Gravemaws were not fighting to kill. Every strike he watched was aimed to disable, to break a weapon arm, to knock a soldier flat and keep them there, and not a single Combine soldier who went down in that corridor failed to get back up eventually. It was restraint, deliberate and precise, from animals the old war records had described as mindless killing machines bred for nothing but slaughter. The remaining Combine soldiers broke and ran for their ship less than a minute later, dragging their wounded with them, and station security, finally arriving in force, was able to seal the docking clamps before the vessel could fully disengage, trapping it long enough to scan its systems and pull a substantial amount of data before its crew managed to force an emergency undocking and flee into open space. That data, recovered in the chaos and handed directly to Ren before the Combine ship had even cleared the station's sensor range, turned out to be worth far more than the ship itself would have been. It contained old breeding logs from Ashfall, decades of them, detailing exactly how the Gravemaw species had been engineered, and more damning, detailing the specific commands and conditioning used to force them into violence against their will during the war. It contained internal Combined communications discussing the abandonment of the Ashfall facility, including explicit orders to destroy any surviving specimens rather than risk them being found alive and used as evidence. And it contained, buried in a maintenance log nobody had ever thought worth erasing, a simple entry noting that 3 pups from the facility's final breeding cycle had gone unaccounted for during the evacuation, presumed dead in the collapse of the eastern bunker. Ren stood in the wreckage of the corridor afterward, surrounded by scorch marks and abandoned Combine weapons, watching Dale kneel beside Biscuit and press a torn piece of his own jacket against the animal's wounded shoulder while Duke and Scout paced a tight, protective circle around them both, and understood, with a clarity that settled something long uneasy in his chest, exactly what story that datapad in his hand was about to tell the entire Galactic Council. It was not the story anyone had expected to hear. Word of what happened on Harrow Station spread faster than any official report could keep up with, and by the time the hearing finally began 3 weeks later, half the galaxy already had an opinion about it, which made Ren's job considerably harder than he had hoped it would be. The council chamber was fuller than Ren had ever seen it, delegates from member species who rarely bothered attending anything crowded into seats along the back wall, all of them there for the same reason. A human hauler had survived a direct assault from a supposedly disbanded faction, using the last 3 living Gravemaws in the galaxy as his only defense, and nobody, from the highest office down to the newest junior clerk, wanted to miss how the council decided to handle it. Dale sat near the front of the chamber in a chair clearly built for a much smaller species. Looking deeply uncomfortable in a jacket Grace had insisted he wear instead of his usual worn one, with Duke, Scout, and Biscuit lying in a loose row at his feet, drawing nervous glances from every delegate who passed by. Biscuit's shoulder was still wrapped, though the wound underneath had already closed far faster than any of the station's medical staff had expected. The speaker called the chamber to order, and Ren rose from his seat to present the data recovered from the combined vessel, laying it out piece by piece with the same careful patience he had used investigating the entire matter from the start. He showed them the breeding logs. He showed them the conditioning records, proof that the violence attributed to the species during the war had been forced rather than natural. He showed them the evacuation order to destroy any surviving pups rather than let them be found, and the maintenance log entry confirming 3 had gone unaccounted for on the very world where Dale had found them years later, starving and alone. The treaty that has governed this species for 300 years, Ren said, letting the chamber's murmur die down before continuing, was written based on records provided almost entirely by the Vantis Combine itself, the same faction that engineered the species as a weapon in the first place, and the same faction that attempted, 3 weeks ago, to erase the last living evidence of what they had done. I would ask this council to consider how much of what we believed about the Gravemaws actually came from the Gravemaws themselves, and how much came from the people who built them. The debate that followed lasted the better part of 2 days, and Dale sat through nearly all of it, growing steadily more restless with every hour, though Duke's heavy weight against his feet and Biscuit's occasional huff of boredom kept him grounded through the worst of it. Grace sat beside him for most of it too, having insisted on making the trip herself, arguing that somebody needed to be there who had actually seen the fight happen and could correct anyone trying to describe it as anything other than 3 animals defending the people they cared about. In the end, the vote was not unanimous, and Ren had not expected it to be. 3 delegations abstained entirely, unwilling to fully abandon 300 years of established fear even in the face of clear evidence. But the majority voted to formally reclassify the species, striking the extermination order from galactic law and replacing it with a protected status, with Dale named as the Gravemaw's legal guardian, a title that came with a great deal of paperwork he had absolutely no interest in filling out himself. You could take the support they're offering, Ren said afterward, finding Dale in a quiet hallway outside the chamber, packing up the last of his things while Duke sniffed curiously at a nearby potted plant that was clearly not going to survive the encounter. Funding, facilities, proper care for all 3 of them. You would not have to keep hauling cargo for a living anymore. Dale considered this for a moment, watching Scout chase a stray beam of light across the floor with the same focus he might have given an actual threat, and Biscuit lean his full weight into Grace's legs, clearly delighted by the attention she kept giving him. They didn't grow up in a facility, Dale said finally. They grew up on my ship, hauling grain and getting yelled at by dock workers and sleeping in a pile in the cargo bay. I don't think turning that into something official is going to make any of us happier. Ren found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he agreed. 6 months later, Dale walked through the market ring of Harrow Station with all 3 of his dogs beside him, same as he had that first day, except everything about the walk was different now. Merchants still glanced up when they passed, but the fear had faded into something closer to careful curiosity, occasional nervous smiles, one particularly brave trader even offering Biscuit a scrap of dried meat, which Biscuit accepted with the enthusiastic gratitude of an animal who had never once considered himself frightening. Grace fell into step beside him near the noodle stall, having taken to joining his walks whenever his cargo runs brought him back through the station, and Ren, on one of his increasingly frequent visits, waited near the docking bay with a small stack of paperwork Dale was going to complain about signing. You're famous, you know, Grace said, watching a small child wave shyly at Duke from a safe distance, and Duke wagged his tail in response with obvious pride. They're famous, Dale said. I'm just the guy who walks them. He knelt down and scratched behind Biscuit's ears, and Biscuit leaned into it with a happy huff, tail thumping against the deck plating, utterly unbothered by the legend the galaxy had built around him. Good boy, Dale said, and meant it exactly as simply as he always had.